This story did not take form overnight. It was crafted in still moments, through long hours of deliberate research and steady, undistracted focus. Every element has been placed with care to create a gentle, immersive listening experience while honoring these events with the depth and respect they truly deserve. At its heart, this channel is guided by a single purpose: to safeguard and retell the stories that time threatens to erase before they quietly disappear into silence. The sun never warns you in South Florida. It just keeps shining, warm and indifferent, while bodies rot behind pharmacies, float face down in bays, and get folded into luggage like broken dolls discarded by something that used to be a man. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. This evening, we uncover 3 disturbing cases where the truth lurked far beneath a harmless surface. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the Suitcase Reaper, South Florida's most chilling serial murder case, the unsolved slaughter that haunted 2 continents, aka the luggage killer, the disposer. Now let's begin. Picture this: a roadside in Cooper City, Florida, June 2000. The humidity is suffocating, the air thick and sweet rotten the way only a southern summer can be. Passing driver slows. There, sitting on the shoulder of the road like forgotten baggage from a canceled trip, is a suitcase, zipped shut, perfectly ordinary on the outside. But something about the way it sits, too heavy, too still, too wrong, sends a chill straight through the chest. When investigators peel back the zipper, the world shifts. Inside, folded and compressed and beaten beyond recognition, is a woman. A human being crammed into that case like she was nothing more than old clothes. And the monster responsible? He was already gone, already planning his next disposal, already circling his next victim somewhere in the glittering, deceptive sprawl of South Florida, moving through the sunshine like a shadow with a smile. This is the story of a killing ground that stretched from Palm Beach to Biscayne Bay. A string of murders so brutally carried out, so coldly deposited along roadsides and in shopping center lots and floating in open water, that detectives would spend over 2 decades hunting a ghost who had already fallen from the sky. This is the story of the South Florida serial murders, a case involving multiple killers, multiple bodies, and a collection of victims who deserved far better than the world gave them. This is the story of women discarded, women silenced, women forgotten by the systems that were supposed to protect them. And this is the story of the detectives who refused to let those women stay forgotten. Sit with this one, because it does not end neatly. It does not end the way justice is supposed to feel. But it ends, and the ending is something you will not see coming. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. There is a version of South Florida that the brochures sell: pristine coastline, Art Deco hotels, ocean breezes, neon and nightlife and perpetual golden hour. Then there is the South Florida that lives in the shadows of all that glamour. The strip malls, the cracked sidewalks, the Salvation Army shelters, the bodies of water that run like dark veins through Broward and Miami-Dade counties, canals so abundant and so deep that they have swallowed secrets for generations. The South Florida that hides its dead well. By the late 1990s, that shadow world had become a hunting ground. The murders that investigators would eventually group together under the broad, terrible umbrella of the South Florida serial murders did not begin with a single explosive event that set the whole region on alert. They began the way so many serial murder cases begin, quietly, almost invisibly, with victims whose deaths the system was too willing to dismiss. Women who had been living on the margins. Women fighting addiction. Women who had been swallowed up by circumstances that left them vulnerable, alone, and working the streets to survive. Women the headlines were slow to name and slower to grieve. The first body dropped in February of 1997. Sandra K. Walters was 32 years old. She had a history with narcotics. She had a history with prostitution. And on the morning of February 25, 1997, she was found strangled. Her body left naked and exposed in the lot behind an adult bookstore in Palm Beach County. The position of the body, the manner of death, the complete absence of clothing, all of it painted a picture of predatory violence, the kind carried out not in a moment of rage, but with deliberate, practiced efficiency. Investigators believed she had been picked up by a client who had no intention of letting her walk away, but who, the strip of highway, had no witnesses willing to come forward. The leads dried up before they had a chance to solidify. Sandra K. Walters was buried, and her killer walked free. Less than a month later, the second body surfaced. On March 16, 1997, a woman's half-clothed remains were discovered in the thick brush behind an Eckerd pharmacy on a busy road in Coral Springs. The discovery sent a ripple through law enforcement that became impossible to ignore once her identity was confirmed. The dead woman was Star Stowe, 40 years old, and Star Stowe had once been famous. In February 1977, she had graced the centerfold of one of the world's most widely read magazines, Playboy, as that month's Playmate of the Month. She had moved in remarkable circles in her time. She had dated the lead singer of one of rock music's most iconic bands. She had been beautiful and celebrated and full of the kind of electric possibility that youth and fame and good fortune can manufacture. But life had redirected itself for Star Stowe in the years following her moment of celebrity. She had relocated to Fort Lauderdale in 1986, chasing a new chapter, hoping to build something as an exotic dancer. Instead, she had been pulled under by addiction, and by the time the mid-90s arrived, she was living in poverty, dependent on drugs, exchanging her body for survival money on the streets of South Florida. Her death made the news in a way that Sandra K. Walters' death had not. Because she had once been famous, because there was a name attached to her that people recognized, because celebrity, even faded celebrity, compels attention that plain humanity does not always receive. But beneath the tabloid angle was the same brutal truth. Star Stowe had been murdered, left discarded in bushes behind a pharmacy. Like garbage, like something disposable. Detectives looked at Walters. They looked at Stowe. Two women, both connected to prostitution, both strangled, both left in the lots and scrub behind commercial buildings along South Florida roads. The similarities were uncomfortable, but uncomfortable is not evidence. And evidence was what investigators were starved for. November 1997 brought a third name. Teresa Kettner was 41 years old. On November 21st, her body was discovered in a grassy area behind a shopping center called Turtle Run Shops in Coral Springs, the same city where Star Stowe had been found. The circumstances were grimly consistent. Discarded in concealed ground, left behind a building that faced a major road. A woman connected to the world of street prostitution. A woman the broader public would not immediately rush to mourn. Teresa Kettner had been murdered, and her body had been deposited in a place designed to slow identification, designed to buy the killer time. 1 week later, the fourth victim, Tammy M. Strunk, was 36 years old. She was homeless. She had last been seen alive 3 days before her murder at a local Salvation Army, seeking shelter in the only way available to her. On November 28, 1997, just 7 days after Teresa Kettner was found, Tammy Strunk's body was discovered inside a trash bin at a shopping center in Sunrise, Florida. Not dumped in the bushes, not left in the grass, but placed inside a trash receptacle. The kind of disposal that communicates something beyond murder, something about the value the killer assigned to his victim. She was garbage, he was saying. She belonged here. Among the evidence collected near Tammy Strunk's body was a detail that would stick in investigators' minds for years. A dark blue towel, folded or discarded with the remains, bearing a monogram in stitching. 3 letters, JSM. That towel would become one of the most tantalizing threads in an entire case full of loose threads. Whose initials were those? Where had the towel come from? No one could say, and no definitive answer would ever come. For women dead in 1997 alone, all found behind or near commercial buildings, all connected to substance abuse and prostitution, all left in outdoor spaces like objects rather than people. The investigation was active. The public was not yet gripped by sustained fear. These were not the kinds of victims whose disappearances triggered Amber Alerts or citywide manhunts. But inside the cramped rooms where homicide detectives spread crime scene photographs across conference tables and circled patterns with red markers, a grim picture was assembling itself. South Florida had a predator, possibly multiple predators. And he or they were moving freely, confidently, through a landscape that offered them an almost unlimited pool of vulnerable targets and an almost unlimited supply of darkness in which to work. What investigators could not yet know was that the darkness was not the work of one set of hands. The years ahead would reveal something even more disturbing than a single monster roaming the streets. South Florida's particular geography of poverty, addiction, and desperation had drawn multiple hunters. The killing ground had attracted more than one predator at a time. And as 1997 bled into 1998 and then into 1999, the bodies would continue to appear, and the picture would grow murkier and darker and more deeply frightening before it would ever begin to clear. One of those predators had a name that no South Florida detective knew yet. He had a face that no composite sketch had captured. He had a history of violence so consistent, so methodical, so geographically sprawling that even the people who would eventually unravel his story would be left staring at the scope of it in disbelief. His name was Roberto Wagner Fernandez, and he had not yet arrived at the full force of what he was capable of. But South Florida was already bleeding, and the bleeding was far from over. The shopping center lots, the grassy medians, the canals reflecting back neon lights at 2 in the morning. The bins and bags and ditches where women's bodies ended up, discovered by dog walkers and delivery drivers and anyone unlucky enough to stumble into the wrong patch of the wrong landscape on the wrong morning. The killing ground was open. The hunters were moving through it, and no one had yet found a way to make them stop. If the year 1997 had laid down the foundation of horror in 4 brutal murders, the years that followed would confirm that foundation into something structural, something that investigators could no longer dismiss as coincidence or unrelated violence. The string of killings continued. The victims kept surfacing. And from within the fog of multiple unsolved cases, 2 specific figures began, slowly, to take shape. 2 separate predators whose paths of violence had crossed, geographically if not personally, through the streets and canals and roadways of South Florida. January 1999. The body of Sheila Griffin, 44 years old, was found partially clothed in a vacant lot in Fort Lauderdale. She had been a nurse. That detail mattered, not because it elevated her above the other victims in any hierarchy of grief, but because it illustrated something important about the radius of danger that now existed in South Florida. Sheila Griffin had not always been living on the streets. She had held a professional title, a career, a place in the formal world. But addiction had dismantled that life piece by piece. By the time she was taken, she was vulnerable in ways she had never been before, and that vulnerability had drawn the attention of something predatory. She had been strangled, she had been sexually assaulted, and she had been left in an abandoned lot as though she had never been a nurse, never been a daughter, never been anything beyond an obstacle to be eliminated. The case would remain unsolved for 2 years. 2 years during which Sheila Griffin's family would receive no answers and investigators would work without resolution. Then, 1 month after Griffin's discovery, February of 1999 delivered another name. Crystal Martin, found strangled inside a Fort Lauderdale motel. The motel, a detail that suggested she had been brought somewhere with an appearance of normalcy before the violence descended. Whoever killed Crystal Martin had been controlled enough to use an indoor space, controlled enough to depart without being seen, controlled enough to leave the body inside a room rather than dumping it in a field. Methodical, practiced, devoid of panic. Her case, like so many of the others from this period, would go unsolved. June 2000 introduced the name Melissa James, 30 years old, found murdered and dumped in a canal in Fort Lauderdale. The canal disposal was a familiar hallmark of South Florida violence. The waterways that crisscrossed the region like a drainage map had, for decades, served as repositories for things that killers needed to disappear. Melissa James had a minor criminal record, placing her in the same broad demographic pattern as many of the other victims. Her death, like those before hers, entered the public record and then faded. The investigation snagged on the same absence of witnesses, the same scarcity of forensic evidence in outdoor environments. But the summer of 2000 was about to deliver something different, something that would move the investigation into a new phase entirely. On June 22, 2000, a passerby on a roadway in Cooper City, Broward County, noticed what appeared to be an abandoned piece of luggage on the shoulder of the road. It was a suitcase, zipped shut, heavy, still, the kind of ordinary object that could sit in that spot for hours before attracting attention, because suitcases get left in strange places, moved during a vehicle breakdown, dropped during a hasty relocation, abandoned in the aftermath of a dispute. Ordinary objects in ordinary places. But this suitcase was not ordinary. When detectives unzipped it, they found Kimberly Dietz Livesey. She was 35 years old. She had been beaten with ferocious, deliberate intensity before her death, the kind of beating that speaks not to loss of control but to sustained, purposeful assault, the kind of beating that takes time. Her blood-soaked clothing was folded beneath her body inside the suitcase. A blouse, a skirt, its top button missing, replaced at some point by a safety pin, a detail that lodged in the minds of every detective who ever read that case file. Kimberly had been folded and compressed and sealed inside the luggage with an eerie competence, the act of someone who had thought about logistics, who understood spatial constraints, who had approached the disposal of a human life with the same practical efficiency that a person might apply to packing before a business trip. Michael Livesey, her estranged husband, identified her from the description of her tattoos in news reports. He had been separated from her, and the forensic evidence and investigation would ultimately clear him. But he would carry the weight of that identification. Tattoos because her face was too damaged for standard recognition for the rest of his life. 20 years later, speaking at a press conference where investigators would finally name her killer, he would say he had waited 2 decades and never believed closure would come. Those words, waited 2 decades and never believed closure would come, are among the most quietly devastating in this entire case. Several weeks after the discovery of Kimberly Dietz Livesey, on August 9, 2000, a road near Dania Beach delivered another body. Sia Demas, also beaten, severely, also disposed of in a container, this time not a suitcase but a duffel bag, the kind of heavy-duty sports bag that people use for gym equipment or camping gear. She had been crammed into that bag and left along the roadside the same way that Kimberly had been sealed into her suitcase. The same methodology, the same calculated brutality, the same contemptuous final act of packaging a human being and depositing them like refuse. Detectives from the Broward Sheriff's Office looked at the 2 cases side by side. The similarities were not subtle. 2 women, both with substance abuse histories, both beaten to death, both stuffed into carrying containers and left along roadways. The crime scenes were different locations, different dates, but the signature, the internal logic of the killer's behavior was nearly identical. Someone was doing this. Someone with a system, someone with access to the kind of ordinary luggage that would not raise immediate eyebrows on a roadway, someone who lived or worked or moved freely through Broward County. Fingerprints had been recovered from evidence at both crime scenes. They matched each other. The killer had left traces, but those fingerprints, run through every available database, returned no name. The killer was not in the system, or so investigators believed at that moment. The name would eventually come, but not for years. On August 30, 2001, a body was found floating in Biscayne Bay in Miami. The water was carrying her slowly, the bay broad and gray and indifferent as any body of water can be when it delivers the dead to shore. Jessica Good was 24 years old. She was a Pompano Beach resident. She had a brother named Thomas who would later describe her as his best friend. She had been stabbed multiple times, a manner of death that differed from the blunt force beatings that had killed Dietz Livesey and Demas, but the investigators from the Broward Sheriff's Office and Miami Police, working in communication with each other, saw the connective tissue. The victim profile, the disposal method. This time water rather than a bag, but disposal nonetheless. her body placed somewhere designed to complicate evidence collection and delay identification. The bay's salt water, the tidal movement, the time she had spent floating, all of it conspired to reduce what forensic evidence remained. But Jessica had done something before leaving her home that night. She had called her boyfriend. She had described the man who had offered her a ride. A light-skinned Hispanic man, driving what appeared to be a work van. That description would not be enough to generate an arrest on its own. But it would be filed, noted, and in the years to come, as other pieces of the puzzle clicked slowly into place, it would take on tremendous significance. Because detectives already had a name they were beginning to circle. A name attached to a Brazilian national who had been living in Miami in the late 1990s. A man who worked for a tour company. A man who drove a van. A man who had left South Florida with suspicious haste on September 1, 2001. One day after Jessica Good's body was found floating in Biscayne Bay. Roberto Wagner Fernandez was gone. And no one knew yet what he had left behind, or how many names were attached to the darkness that traveled with him. The investigation went cold. But another monster in another corner of this story was still very much present, and still very much active. The South Florida serial murders case is not the story of one killer. It never was. That is what makes it so persistently disturbing. The fact that within a relatively contained geographic corridor, during an overlapping stretch of years, multiple predators were operating with enough independence and enough cunning to evade justice simultaneously. The geography itself seemed to enable them. South Florida's network of highways, canals, and commercial corridors offered cover. Its population of transient and marginalized women offered targets. And the structural failures of systems designed to protect vulnerable people, failures of housing, of healthcare, of addiction services, of law enforcement attention, offered opportunity. While Roberto Wagner Fernandez was packaging women in luggage and depositing them along Broward County roadsides, another predator had been working nearby. His name was Joel Tiller, and Joel Tiller had a history that should have terrified anyone who ever read it in full. He was born in 1952, and his violent resume stretched back to 1968, when he was just 16 years old and living in Atlanta, Georgia. At that age, an age when most teenagers are worrying about school and socializing, Tiller murdered a woman. He was convicted. He eventually served time and was released, which, given everything that came next, stands as one of the most consequential failures of the American penal system documented in this entire case. After his release from Georgia incarceration, Tiller moved. He resurfaced in San Diego, California, where in 1996 he was convicted of choking and raping a woman. Again, violent, intimate, predatory in the most extreme and terrifying sense. He served a brief period in California custody and was released again. He moved again, this time to Florida. He arrived in Fort Lauderdale in 1999. Within months of his arrival, Sheila Griffin, the former nurse found strangled in a vacant lot in January of that same year, was dead. Now, the critical forensic connection between Tiller and Griffin was not established immediately. The science would take time. The DNA processing, the database matching, the bureaucratic gears of intersecting law enforcement jurisdictions, all of it would take time. But the connection that eventually emerged was iron. Tiller's DNA, collected during his arrest for unrelated charges in Miami on June 27, 2001, was run against outstanding case evidence. It matched the DNA recovered from Sheila Griffin's crime scene. Joel Tiller had murdered Sheila Griffin. He was also connected, through DNA evidence, to the rape and robbery of an 88-year-old tourist in Orlando in January of 2001. A detail so grotesquely indiscriminate that it extended the portrait of Tiller from targeted predator to something even more troubling. A man whose violence was nonspecific, opportunistic, unconstrained by victim profile or geography. An 88-year-old tourist, a former nurse in her 40s. A decade-spanning career of rape and murder that crossed multiple states. This was not a man who had committed an act of violence once and descended into moral catastrophe. This was a man who had been committing acts of violence his entire adult life, who had lit a woman on fire in front of her own daughter at some point in his history. An act so savage and so theatrical in its cruelty that it defies even the desensitized vocabulary of true crime. and who had been recycled back into free society at multiple junctures when the system should have recognized what it was releasing. In 2003, Joel Tiller received 2 life sentences. He was gone from the streets, but by that point, the damage he had done across decades was irreversible. Investigators acknowledged, carefully and without overpromising, the possibility that he might have been responsible for some of the other murders in the South Florida cluster. The ones that remained unattributed. But they could not prove it, and so those cases remained, as they remain today, open wounds in the public record. Meanwhile, the hunt for Roberto Wagner Fernandez was taking place on a different kind of terrain altogether. Fernandez had fled to Brazil. This much investigators eventually confirmed. He left South Florida on September 1, 2001, one day after Jessica Good's body was recovered from Biscayne Bay. The timing was not coincidental. He knew law enforcement attention was turning. He knew his name had surfaced in connection with the inquiry, and he ran. But running for Fernandez was not a new behavior. It was almost a biographical constant. In 1996, he had been accused of murdering his own wife in Brazil. He claimed self-defense. He was acquitted, but the acquittal did nothing to erase him from law enforcement consciousness in his home country. He remained a person of interest in numerous violent crimes against women in Brazil, a shadow suspect in a portfolio of cases that painted a picture of habitual, escalating predation. He had come to South Florida in the late 1990s and, if investigators' growing suspicions were accurate, had continued his violence against women with barely a pause for recalibration. He had worked for a tour company in Miami. He had driven a van, a work van, exactly the kind that Jessica Good had described to her boyfriend before walking out of her door for the last time. He had access to luggage, the kind of ordinary logistical access that would explain how a man could procure a suitcase large enough to contain a person and dispose of it along a county road without raising immediate concern. He had beaten Kimberly Dietz Livesey to death and packed her into that suitcase. He had beaten Sia Demas to death and compressed her into that duffel bag. He had stabbed Jessica Good and put her into the bay. And then he had gone home. Investigators in South Florida did not simply abandon the case when Fernandez vanished into Brazil. The fingerprints recovered from the 2 Broward County crime scenes were in the evidence files. The DNA collected from all 3 murders was preserved. The case was cold, meaning it was not generating active daily investigative work. But cold does not mean closed. Cold means waiting. The breakthrough would begin in 2011, when a DNA profile from the Miami homicide, Jessica Good's murder, was matched against the unknown suspect profile collected from the Broward County scenes. 1 killer, all 3 deaths. The fingerprints also matched. The puzzle had been assembled, even if the central piece, the identity behind the DNA, remained a blank. Then the identity came. Fingerprints taken from Fernandez after his wife's death in Brazil years earlier, preserved in Brazilian law enforcement records, matched the fingerprints lifted from the crime scenes in Broward County. The name had a face. The face had a history, and that history made every detective who read it feel simultaneously vindicated and sick. But there was one devastating problem. Roberto Wagner Fernandez had died in 2005. He had been piloting a small aircraft between Brazil and Paraguay. He was a licensed pilot, a fact that added yet another dimension to the portrait of a man with skills and resources and confidence. And the plane had crashed. He was dead. Or was he? South Florida detectives, steeped in a case full of calculated deception, were not willing to simply accept a death certificate and close the file. Fernandez had made enemies in Brazil. People had reportedly been seeking to settle scores with him over his wife's death. There was speculation, uncomfortable, impossible to immediately dismiss, that he might have staged the crash, that the grave in Brazil might contain someone else's remains, that a man devious enough to pack murdered women into luggage and deposit them on a county road might be devious enough to fake his own death and disappear into the jungles of South America. Investigators were going to need to dig him up. The decision to exhume a body is never made casually. It requires legal authorization. It requires intergovernmental diplomacy when that body rests in a foreign country. It requires the kind of sustained institutional will that is genuinely difficult to maintain across decades, across rotating personnel, across the inevitable pressures and priorities that compete for law enforcement resources every single day. The South Florida serial murders case, by the time investigators began seriously pursuing exhumation, had already consumed 20 years of investigative effort with no arrest, no trial, and no public declaration of responsibility. The families of Kimberly Dietz Livesey, Sia Demas, and Jessica Good had been waiting in a specific kind of purgatory, knowing their loved ones had been murdered, not knowing by whom, watching the years accumulate without answers. For those families, 20 years is not a number. It is a lived experience. It is 2 decades of anniversaries, of birthdays that pass without a phone call, of news stories that occasionally revive the cases and then fall silent again, of a grief that cannot fully conclude because the narrative has no ending. Michael Livesey, the estranged husband of Kimberly Dietz Livesey, had identified his wife by her tattoos because her face was unrecognizable after what Fernandez had done to her. He had lived with that image for 20 years. Thomas Good, Jessica's brother, had described her as his best friend and had carried her absence through 2 decades of his own life. These were not statistics. These were people orbiting an open wound. The key to cracking open the Brazilian component of the investigation turned out to come from a completely different case. In 2015, in Palm Beach County, a physician named Dr. Ronald Schwartz was murdered by a man who subsequently fled to Cuba. Cuba, like Brazil, has no extradition agreement with the United States, meaning that a fugitive who makes it across the water to either country is functionally beyond the reach of American justice under traditional legal frameworks. But investigators in the Schwartz case pursued a novel strategy. Rather than demanding extradition, they worked with Cuban prosecutors to try the suspect in a Cuban court, using evidence gathered by American law enforcement, prosecuted under Cuban jurisdiction. In 2018, Marcos Ernesto Yanes Gutierrez was convicted in Cuba for the murder of Dr. Schwartz. That case was a blueprint. Broward Sheriff's Office detectives took that blueprint and applied it to Brazil. They began working with the Brazilian National Police, with the United States Department of Justice, with the FBI. They built a relationship. They made their case for the exhumation of Roberto Wagner Fernandez remains, arguing that even with the suspect dead, confirming his identity as the killer would provide irreplaceable resolution for the victims' families and potentially help link him to other unsolved murders in multiple countries. Brazilian authorities agreed. In late 2020 and early 2021, investigators traveled to the grave in Brazil. They excavated it. They found remains inside. They collected DNA. The wait for results was its own kind of torment, a final suspended moment before either confirmation or collapse of 20 years of investigative effort. The DNA matched. The profile pulled from Roberto Wagner Fernandez exhumed remains was consistent, conclusively, with the unknown suspect profile collected from all 3 South Florida crime scenes. The fingerprints matched the fingerprints from the Broward County evidence. The DNA matched the Miami Bay case. Roberto Wagner Fernandez, tour company driver, licensed pilot, Brazilian national, acquitted wife killer, South Florida resident, had beaten Kimberly Dietz Livesey to death and folded her into a suitcase. He had beaten Sia Demas to death and sealed her into a duffel bag. He had stabbed Jessica Good and released her body into Biscayne Bay. He was confirmed, officially and forensically, as a serial killer. On August 31, 2021, Broward County Sheriff Gregory Toney stood before cameras and the assembled families of the victims and pronounced those words that had taken 21 years to arrive. He named Fernandez. He described the evidence. He credited the detectives who had never stopped working. He extended condolences to the families. And he added something that stopped the room cold, something that any honest law enforcement official in this case was obligated to say. They believed there were other victims. Based on Fernandez's behavioral history, his violence against women in Brazil, his suspected involvement in multiple unsolved prostitution-linked homicides in South Florida throughout the late 1990s, his employment profile that gave him access to a van and freedom of movement across multiple counties, his status as a licensed pilot who could have traveled extensively. Investigators stated plainly that they did not believe the 3 confirmed murders were the totality of his violence. Detective Zachary Scott, who had worked the case for years, said clearly that someone with this kind of escalating violence toward victims and this level of disregard for human life almost certainly had not limited himself to 3 known murders. The arithmetic of his time in South Florida is genuinely chilling when you lay it out. He first appeared in the Miami area with regularity sometime after his wife's death in November 1996. He left on September 1, 2001. That is roughly 5 years in South Florida. During those 5 years, a string of unsolved murders of women connected to street prostitution occurred in the same geographic corridor where he lived and worked and drove. For murders in 1997 alone, all in commercial areas along major highways, the exact terrain that a tour company van driver would move through every single day. The investigators and researchers who have examined this case most exhaustively have found at least 7 unsolved murders of sex workers in South Florida between 1997 and 2001 that fit the pattern associated with Fernandez's known crimes. 7. Possibly more. 7 women whose names were Sandra K. Walters, Star Stowe, Teresa Kettner, Tammy Strunk, Crystal Martin, Melissa James, and the former nurse Sheila Griffin, who was ultimately confirmed to be the work of Joel Tiller, not Fernandez, adding the complication of 2 simultaneous predators in the same territory. But even factoring out the Griffin case, the shadow of Fernandez falls across multiple others with an uncomfortable persistence. And then there is the broader question. Fernandez worked for a tour company. He was a licensed pilot. He traveled between South Florida and Brazil with regularity. There is no forensic boundary, no invisible line, that says his violence was exclusive to the streets of Broward and Miami-Dade. Investigators in Brazil had documented him as a suspect in violent crimes against women there. He may have killed in other American cities. He may have killed in other countries. The full geography of Roberto Wagner Fernandez violence may never be mapped with certainty. That is the part that does not resolve. That is the part that sits in the chest when you consider this case in its totality. But there are also the women themselves, and those names deserve to fill the room completely before this story reaches its conclusion. Sandra K. Walters was 32 years old and was found nude and strangled in Palm Beach County in February of 1997. Star Stowe was 40 years old, once celebrated, once vibrant, found half-naked in the Coral Springs brush in March 1997. Teresa Kettner was 41 years old, found in the grass behind a shopping center in November 1997. Tammy Strunk was 36 years old, homeless, her body left in a trash bin just 1 week after Kettner, that mysterious monogram towel nearby. Crystal Martin was found strangled in a Fort Lauderdale motel in February 1999. Sheila Griffin was 44 years old, a former nurse, found strangled in a vacant lot in January 1999. Her case ultimately solved by DNA pointing to Joel Tiller, a man whose criminal history alone could fuel its own series. Melissa James was 30 years old, found in a canal in June 2000. Kimberly Dietz Livesey was 35 years old, beaten and sealed in luggage on a Cooper City roadside in June 2000. Sia Demas was beaten and compressed into a duffel bag in Dania Beach in August 2000. Jessica Good was 24 years old, stabbed and set adrift in Biscayne Bay in August 2001. 10 women, across 4 years. Multiple killers, multiple methods, multiple jurisdictions. A case that spanned 2 continents and took more than 2 decades to partially resolve. Partially, that word is load-bearing. Because as the cameras packed up after that August 2021 press conference, and as the families of the 3 confirmed Fernandez victims finally received names to attach to the darkness that had claimed their loved ones, the cases of the other women remained open. The monogram towel near Tammy Strunk's body, the JSM initials still unidentified. The strangling of Sandra K. Walters, still unattributed. The death of Star Stowe, still carrying an unresolved investigation behind the tabloid story of her life. Crystal Martin, Melissa James, Teresa Kettner, unsolved. And Detective Zachary Scott's phone number, 954-321 for 214, still exists, still active, still accepting tips from anyone who knows something about Roberto Fernandez and the additional murders that investigators believe he committed. The hunting ground of South Florida claimed those women across its sweltering, indifferent landscape, and the ground has not fully surrendered its secrets. The canals still run dark. The shopping center lots are still lit by sodium vapor. The roadsides still carry the ordinary weight of luggage that no one examines too closely. The sun keeps shining, and somewhere in the unsolved arithmetic of this case, answers still wait to be excavated. Joel Tiller spent his remaining years in a prison for the criminally insane. A man who had set fire to a woman in front of her daughter, who had murdered at 16, who had moved through decades of violence and state-sanctioned release like a recurring nightmare the justice system kept half forgetting. Roberto Wagner Fernandez died at 40 years old in the wreckage of a small plane over the border between Brazil and Paraguay in 2005. If Detective Scott's words are correct, if his final moments were full of terror, then they were moments that could not begin to account for the terror he had manufactured in the lives of his victims, their families, and the investigators who spent careers chasing a ghost who had died before they could reach him. There was no trial, no life sentence, no moment of formal, public accountability with Fernandez sitting in a defendant's chair, hearing the full weight of what he had done enumerated before a jury. The families got a press conference and a DNA match. They got a name on a case file. They got the knowledge that the man who killed their daughters, their sisters, their best friends, died in a burning aircraft after years of running. For some of them, that was something. For all of them, it was not enough. It is never enough. The South Florida serial murders case stands as a monument to the specific vulnerability of women who live at the margins. Women whose deaths the system was slow to link, slow to prioritize, slow to pursue with the full force of its resources. It stands as a testament to the detectives who worked against that institutional inertia, who kept those case files from being sealed permanently, who flew to Brazil and convinced a court to open a dead man's grave in pursuit of justice for 3 women whose lives had already been dismissed once. And it stands as a reminder, permanent, uncomfortable, necessary, that the predators who move through the everyday landscape of human life often look ordinary. They drive vans. They work day jobs. They live in apartment complexes and walk past their neighbors without anyone knowing what they carry inside them. South Florida never announced that it was a hunting ground. It just was one. And it may still be. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Angel of Death in Ward B. Inside the mind of Petr Zelenka, a.k.a. the Needle in the Dark. He tucked his patients in at night, smiled at their families in the hallways, and somewhere beneath the starched white uniform, carried a hidden vial filled with enough poison to dissolve a human being from the inside out, and nobody suspected a thing. Picture the one place on Earth where you are supposed to be completely safe. You are lying in a hospital bed, too weak to stand, too sick to fight, and the one person standing between you and death is the nurse leaning over your arm with a syringe. Now imagine that the nurse is not there to save you. Imagine that behind those calm, practiced eyes is something hollow and cold. Something that has already decided, before you even opened your eyes that morning, that today might be the day you stop breathing. That is not a nightmare. That is what happened in the corridors of Havlikov Brod Hospital in the Czech Republic throughout the year 2006. 7 people went in expecting to come home. They never did. 10 more came terrifyingly close to joining them. And the man responsible was not a phantom, not a ghost, not some shadowy figure slipping through locked doors. He was the person the patients called when they needed help. He was the one who answered. His name was Petr Zelenka, and the weapon he chose was so invisible, so medically familiar, so utterly without fingerprints, that it nearly worked forever. There is a particular kind of dread that belongs exclusively to betrayal at its deepest level, the kind that does not arrive loudly with sirens and screaming, but instead creeps in on soft-soled shoes through a dimly lit corridor at 2 in the morning, carrying a clipboard and wearing the face of someone you trust with your life. That was the world Petr Zelenka inhabited. That was the mask he wore, and he wore it with extraordinary precision for years before anyone thought to look beneath it. He was born on the 27th of February, 1976, the firstborn child of a family of modest but educated parents living in the Czech Republic. By all outward appearances, his upbringing was unremarkable in the way that many childhoods are. Nothing so broken that it screamed for attention. Nothing so scarred that it left obvious marks on the surface. He had a younger sister. His parents had finished high school. They were, in the estimation of those who knew them, a perfectly ordinary family. And that ordinariness is perhaps the most unsettling detail of all, because it strips away the comfortable narrative that monsters are born from visible catastrophe. Petr Zelenka did not come from ruins. He came from a quiet house on an ordinary street, and whatever darkness grew inside him did so in private, feeding on something that no family photograph could ever have captured. He trained in nursing and medical assistance, and he was, by all early accounts, competent. Not brilliant, not exceptional, competent. The kind of worker who shows up, performs his duties, does not cause friction, and blends into the background of institutional life with practiced ease. When he eventually secured a position at Havlíčkův Brod Hospital, a regional medical facility sitting roughly 100 kilometers southeast of Prague, in the heart of the Bohemian Moravian Highlands, he arrived without fanfare. Colleagues found him quiet, reserved, not particularly warm, but not cold enough to raise concern. He had a certain detachment that some interpreted as professionalism and others, in retrospect, would describe as something else entirely. Something emptier. Havlíčkův Brod Hospital was not a grand metropolitan institution. It was a regional facility, the kind of hospital that serves communities where people know their neighbors, where doctors recognize families across generations, and where the staff members develop the kind of familiarity with one another that comes from years of shared shifts, shared exhaustion, and shared responsibility. It was, in other words, a place built on trust. And trust, as Petr Zelenka would demonstrate with horrifying clarity, can be the most lethal vulnerability of all. By 2006, Zelenka had been working at the hospital long enough to have earned a degree of institutional confidence. He understood the routines. He knew which wards were busy, which were quieter after midnight, which supervisors were thorough and which ones tended to drift. He understood medication protocols with the kind of intimate fluency that comes from daily handling. He knew what was kept where, how it was labeled, how it moved through the system, and crucially, how it could move through the system without drawing attention. He was, at some point, elevated to the position of head nurse and placed in charge of the entire intensive care unit. The hospital had, in its desire to reward reliability, handed him something far more dangerous than a title. It had handed him unsupervised authority over the most vulnerable patients in the building. The intensive care unit is a place of extremes. Patients arrive there at the edges of their lives, their bodies already engaged in desperate internal warfare, hearts that flutter instead of beat, lungs that labor instead of breathe, blood pressures that spike and plunge like something possessed. The patients in that ward exist in a state of radical dependency, dependent on machines, on medications, on the judgments of the medical professionals around them. They cannot always speak for themselves. They cannot always report what is happening to their bodies. They are, in the most literal sense, at the mercy of the people in that room. Petr Zelenka knew all of this, and at some point during the spring of 2006, he made a decision that would shatter the lives of 17 families and leave an entire nation questioning everything it thought it understood about the sacred relationship between patient and caregiver. The weapon he selected was heparin, a drug so common in hospital settings that its presence on a medication trolley would raise no eyebrows whatsoever. Heparin is an anticoagulant, a blood-thinning agent used routinely in medicine to prevent dangerous clots from forming in the arteries and veins of patients who are particularly vulnerable to them. In the correct dosage, it is a life-saving compound, a guardian of circulation, a chemical intervention that has preserved countless lives across decades of clinical practice. Medical professionals handle it every single day. It is, in the vocabulary of hospital life, mundane. But heparin has another side, a side that any trained nurse knows with absolute certainty. Administered in doses dramatically above therapeutic levels, heparin does not simply thin the blood. It obliterates the blood's ability to clot entirely. It strips away the body's most fundamental self-repair mechanism and leaves behind a physiological catastrophe. Internal bleeding begins. Slow at first, then accelerating, organs weeping blood into spaces where blood does not belong, tissues saturating with hemorrhage that the body can no longer stop. It is an agonizing process. It is not quick. And because heparin is already present in hospital environments as a standard medication, its presence in a patient's bloodstream does not, on its own, automatically signal foul play. It might simply look like a dosing error. It might look like a complication. It might look, to an understaffed and overworked team of clinicians dealing with genuinely critical patients, like nothing more sinister than the tragic unpredictability of serious illness. This is what Zelenka understood. This is what he counted on. He carried his hidden vial with him. According to what would later emerge during the investigation and trial, he concealed heparin on his person and administered it to patients covertly. Not through any official medication order, not logged in any chart, not with any witness present. He would approach a patient who was already fragile, already fighting, already positioned on the knife's edge between survival and collapse, and he would inject them. Then he would step back. Then he would wait. Then he would watch. The first suspicious deaths began appearing in May of 2006. Patients in the intensive care unit began dying from what appeared to be severe internal bleeding events. Events that were initially absorbed into the broader, tragic context of a ward where critically ill patients are always at risk. Intensive care is a place where people die. Doctors and nurses are not strangers to loss. The hospital, like all hospitals, had a culture of accepting a certain frequency of death as unavoidable. And in that acceptance, reasonable, human, understandable, Zelenka found his cover. He continued through the summer. June, July, August. Each time a patient hemorrhaged without obvious cause, the clinical team searched for medical explanations. Perhaps the underlying condition had deteriorated faster than anticipated. Perhaps there had been a dosing miscalculation somewhere in the chain of care. Perhaps it was simply the terrible lottery of critical illness, claiming another life before the medicine could catch up. These are the explanations that hospital staff reach for because they are the most common explanations, and because the alternative, that someone in their own ward was deliberately poisoning patients, is so far outside the frame of normal clinical reasoning that it does not surface easily, if at all. Petr Zelenka was not chaotic or erratic in the way that some killers are. He did not select victims based on personal grievance or emotional entanglement. He did not target people he knew outside the hospital or carry any visible hostility toward the individuals he harmed. His victims were elderly men and women, critically ill patients of varying ages and backgrounds, people who had arrived at the hospital expecting treatment and healing. What they shared was not a relationship with their killer but a location. They were in his ward, on his shift, within reach of his hidden vial. They were, in the cruelest reduction of human life, convenient. What drove him to do it? That question would consume investigators, prosecutors, psychologists, and journalists for years. And the answers Zelenka provided were, in their own disturbing way, more unsettling than no answer at all. At various points, he claimed he wanted to see some action. He said he did it to test the doctors, to see whether the medical staff around him was competent enough to identify what he was doing and intervene. As though the patients he was killing were props in an elaborate and personal examination, he had decided to administer without anyone's consent, as though their lives were puzzle pieces in his private intellectual game. His lawyer would later characterize this as evidence of mental illness, a delusional arrogance that had disconnected him from normal moral reasoning. Prosecutors saw something else in it, a cold, methodical pattern of behavior that spoke not of madness but of calculation. What is particularly chilling about the testing the doctor's rationale is the layer of contempt it reveals. If Zelenka is to be believed, and even his partial explanations must be weighed against his demonstrated willingness to deceive, he was not simply indifferent to his victims. He was using them. He saw himself as standing above the entire institution, above his colleagues, above the patients, above the system, conducting an evaluation that nobody had authorized and nobody could pass, because passing it would require discovering what he was doing. And for 7 months, nobody discovered it. Whether that vindicated his contempt for those around him or horrified him, no one can say with certainty. What is certain is that he kept going. By September of 2006, the pattern had become undeniable enough that internal scrutiny began to intensify. The frequency of bleeding events in the intensive care unit was statistically anomalous. Too many occurrences, too similar in character, clustering around shifts and circumstances that could not be entirely explained by the acuity of the patient population. Administrators began examining records more closely. Zelenka was dismissed from his position at the end of September, though investigators would later criticize the hospital's director for taking far too long to act on the warning signs that had been mounting for months. The director, Joseph Pedjel, was ultimately dismissed from his own position for the delay. Even after Zelenka's dismissal, the full picture had not yet assembled itself into clarity. An internal audit deepened the alarm when forensic and clinical review began identifying abnormal coagulation profiles in multiple patients. The chemical signature of heparin in quantities that could not be explained by standard treatment. The investigation escalated. By December of 2006, Petr Zelenka was placed under arrest. The quiet nurse who had walked those corridors for years, who had pushed the medication trolley and answered the call bell and smiled at visitors in the hallway, was finally standing in handcuffs rather than in scrubs. When confronted with the weight of evidence assembled against him, Zelenka offered a partial confession. He admitted to administering heparin to 5 patients. He denied responsibility for the other 2 confirmed deaths, claiming those particular confessions had been obtained through police coercion. Investigators and prosecutors disputed that account vigorously. The court, after reviewing the evidence, did not find his selective confession convincing. 7 deaths, 10 near fatalities, 17 families whose lives had been rearranged by the actions of a man who had used a syringe and a vial of anticoagulant as instruments of deliberate destruction. The Czech Republic had not seen anything like it in its post-communist history, and as the case moved toward trial, as the full scope of what had happened in that intensive care ward began to emerge in public testimony and forensic detail, the country found itself confronting a profoundly disturbing question, not just about Petr Zelenka, but about the systems and institutions that had allowed him to operate unseen for so long. About the terrible, dangerous assumption that the person standing at your bedside with a syringe is there to heal you. To understand the full weight of what Petr Zelenka did inside Havlikov Brod Hospital, you must first understand the particular atmosphere of an intensive care unit in the small hours of the morning, because that is where the darkness lives in this story, and it is not a metaphorical darkness. It is the literal, fluorescent-lit, antiseptic-scented, deeply human darkness of a place where people fight for their lives while the world outside sleeps. Intensive care units at night operate on reduced staff. The pace is different. There is no bustling of visiting families, no administrative churn, no consultants arriving with clipboards for morning rounds. There are instead the mechanical rhythms of ventilators, the soft persistence of cardiac monitors, the occasional shuffle of a nurse moving from bed to bed with practiced quiet so as not to disturb those patients whose sleep is shallow and precious. It is a world of muted sounds and dim lighting, of vigilance compressed into a small team of professionals who are expected to be the last line of defense between their patients and catastrophe. Petr Zelenka moved through this world with the confidence of a man who belonged there, because, of course, he did belong there. He was not an intruder. He was not a stranger navigating unfamiliar territory. He knew where every drug was stored. He knew the rhythm of every monitor. He knew which patients were alert enough to notice something unusual and which ones were far too ill, far too sedated, far too consumed by the battle inside their own bodies to register the moment when an uninvited substance entered their bloodstream. The victims he chose were overwhelmingly elderly, predominantly those already in the most precarious stages of whatever illness had brought them to the ward. These were not patients who would be expected to spring from their beds and raise an alarm. Many were too confused by the physiological stress of critical illness to articulate that something had changed. Some were sedated. Some were ventilated and physically unable to speak at all. They were, in the most vulnerable sense imaginable, captive to the care of whoever stood beside them. And on the nights when Zelenka stood beside them, that care became something else entirely. The mechanism of heparin poisoning is not a sudden, dramatic event. It does not announce itself immediately. When Zelenka injected his hidden vial's contents into a patient's foreline or directly into their tissue, the drug spread through the circulatory system with quiet efficiency. The first thing it dismantled was the clotting cascade, the complex biochemical sequence by which the body responds to vascular injury by forming protective clots to seal breaches and prevent hemorrhage. In a body already strained by serious illness, the clotting system may already be compromised, already working harder than it should. Flooding that system with excessive heparin did not simply impair it. It effectively destroyed it, leaving the patient's blood functionally unable to coagulate under any circumstances. What followed was internal bleeding, not the dramatic external hemorrhage that might prompt immediate intervention, but the slow, invisible kind. Blood seeping into tissue spaces, pooling in the abdominal cavity, collecting around organs that had no business being bathed in blood. The patient's vital signs would begin to shift. Blood pressure dropping, heart rate climbing in the body's desperate compensatory response. Pallor deepening as red blood cells flooded into spaces where they could not carry oxygen to tissues that needed it. Pain, when the patient could experience and report pain, might manifest in the abdomen or the chest depending on where the internal hemorrhage was most pronounced. For those too altered by illness or sedation to communicate clearly, the signs might be entirely physiological, numbers on monitors beginning to trend in the wrong direction, the clinical picture deteriorating with a speed that appeared inexplicable. For the nursing and medical staff who encountered these deteriorations, the instinctive response was to treat them as medical emergencies arising from the patient's underlying conditions. This is what clinicians are trained to do. When a critically ill patient's blood pressure falls, you intervene for the most likely cause first. You give fluids. You check the medications on the chart. You call for additional support. You do not, in the moment of acute deterioration, begin with the hypothesis that a member of your own nursing staff has just injected the patient with something that was not on any chart and is not on any order. You do not go there because it is not where clinical training sends you, and because it requires a level of institutional suspicion that is extraordinarily rare in environments built on professional trust. Zelenka understood this with the precision of someone who had thought about it carefully. The window between his covert injection and the patient's clinical deterioration gave him time and distance. By the time the emergency response was in motion, he was simply one of the nurses working the emergency, perhaps even participating in the resuscitation effort, moving around the bedside with the controlled urgency of someone responding to a crisis rather than causing one. The perversity of this is almost beyond articulation. The person who had initiated the disaster was present at the disaster's unfolding, watching, and in some accounts behaving with professional composure. Those who survived Zelenka's attacks, and 10 people did survive, their bodies pulling back from the edge through a combination of emergency medical intervention and what might charitably be described as fortune, were left with the aftermath of severe internal hemorrhage. The medical team treating them had administered antidotes and supportive care, working with genuine urgency to reverse the damage. Vitamin K and fresh frozen plasma, agents used to counteract heparin's anticoagulant effect, were part of the clinical response. Some patients recovered completely. Others were left with the residual effects of significant blood loss and whatever physical insult the experience had inflicted on already compromised systems. None of them, in those early months, had been told what had actually happened to them. They had been told their condition had worsened unexpectedly. They had been told it was a complication. They had been told the thing that was, at the time, what the hospital genuinely believed. The 7 who died were not all identical in circumstance. Some deteriorated rapidly, their bodies overwhelmed too quickly for intervention to reverse the damage. Others fought longer, their deaths drawn out across hours as their systems struggled against an invisible tide of internal hemorrhage. All of them had arrived at the hospital not to die but to be healed. All of them were, by the time Zelenka approached them with his hidden vial, trusting the institution that housed them and the staff that cared for them with the entirety of their lives. That trust was not ambiguous or conditional. It was absolute, and it was absolutely betrayed. What is perhaps most haunting about the geography of these events is how ordinary the setting was. Havlikov Brod is not a large city. Its hospital was not a grand or formidable institution. The intensive care ward where the majority of Zelenka's crimes occurred was not some secretive, restricted environment. It was a standard clinical space, equipped and staffed in the way that regional hospitals across Central Europe are equipped and staffed. The patients' families came and went through the visiting hours. Flowers were brought. Hands were held. Prayers were said quietly in plastic chairs beside beds. The ordinary rituals of illness and hope and vigil played out around the invisible horror that Zelenka was perpetrating. Some of those families sat beside their loved ones in the hours after Zelenka had administered his injection, watching the deterioration begin without any comprehension of what they were watching. They spoke to the nurses, perhaps to Zelenka himself, and received the reassurances that a nurse in a normal hospital setting would offer. They were told the doctors were doing everything they could. They were told the patient had taken a turn. They were told to be strong. What none of them were told, because no one yet knew, was that the suffering they were witnessing was not the disease taking its terrible natural course. It was deliberate. It was chosen. It was the result of a decision made in private by a man in a white uniform who had decided, for reasons the human mind struggles to fully contain, that their loved one's life was a resource for his own purposes. Among the cases that came to the attention of investigators as the internal audit deepened, patterns began to crystallize with disturbing clarity. The clustering of severe coagulation anomalies was too dense to be coincidental. Patients who had been, by clinical assessment, stable or improving had destabilized suddenly and severely. Some of these events had occurred on specific shifts that could be cross-referenced against staff schedules. The name that appeared repeatedly in those schedule records was Petr Zelenka. Not always. Not with the kind of mechanical regularity that made the conclusion obvious before the forensic work was done. But with a frequency that became, as the picture came into focus, impossible to explain away. When investigators began the more technical forensic analysis, examining blood samples, reviewing medication records, conducting toxicological assessments, the chemical evidence that accumulated was damning. Heparin at levels consistent with significant overdose was identifiable in the biological material from patients who had died or nearly died under circumstances previously attributed to illness progression. The drug had been there. It had been there in quantities that had no clinical justification, and it had been there in patients whose medical charts contained no order for the administration of heparin at those dosage levels. The hospital's administration, by the time these findings were solidifying, was in crisis. The director would later be dismissed for the delays that had allowed Zelenka to continue for as long as he did. There were serious institutional questions about why the anomalies had not triggered faster alarm, why the clustering of unexplained hemorrhagic deaths in a single ward had not prompted earlier and more aggressive internal review. The healthcare system in the Czech Republic found itself confronting questions about oversight, about the checks that should exist when a pattern of suspicious death emerges in a clinical setting, about the degree to which institutional cultures of professional solidarity can delay the recognition of institutional crimes. For the Czech public, the case as it emerged through late 2006 and into the trial period of 2008 was viscerally disturbing in a way that few criminal cases managed to be. It was not simply that people had been killed. It was that they had been killed in the one place where society makes its most fundamental promise of protection. When you enter a hospital, you are making a compact with the medical profession, a compact based on the assumption that everyone wearing a uniform in that building is oriented toward your survival. Zelenka had shattered that compact in the most direct way imaginable. He had put on the uniform. He had walked the corridors. He had carried the syringe. And he had made a different choice. The arrests, when they came in December of 2006, removed him from the public world. But the questions he left behind were not so easily contained. There are criminals whose motivations, however horrifying, possess a certain grim logic that the human mind can at least follow to its conclusion. The logic of greed, the logic of fury, the logic of a self that has been wounded into violence. And then there are criminals whose motivations open onto something far more disorienting. A private interior landscape so alien in its values and reasoning that it confronts the observer with the fundamental strangeness of another consciousness. Petr Zelenka belongs to the second category. Not because his psychology is beyond analysis, it has been analyzed extensively, but because the analysis, when complete, arrives at a motive that is somehow worse than the familiar ones. He wanted to test the doctors. Sit with that for a moment. 7 people died. 10 more came to the precipice. 17 families were devastated. An entire hospital was traumatized. A nation's faith in its healthcare institutions was shaken. And the explanation that Zelenka offered, or that his lawyer offered on his behalf, framing it in the language of impulsive compulsion, was that he wanted to see whether the medical staff around him was competent enough to detect what he was doing. This is not a motive born of hatred for his victims. It is almost worse than that, because it means the victims as individuals were entirely irrelevant to Petr Zelenka. They were not people he despised. They were not people who had wronged him. They were not selected for anything other than their availability and their vulnerability. They were, in the cold framework of his private logic, instruments, measuring devices, components of a test that existed only inside his own mind and served only his own obscure purposes. The arrogance embedded in this rationale is extraordinary in its dimensions. To view yourself as the examiner of an entire medical institution, to believe that you possess the authority and the insight to evaluate your colleague's competence through a covert experiment conducted at the expense of the patients in your care, requires a self-image so inflated and so detached from reality that it borders on the grandiose. Clinical psychologists who have examined cases of healthcare serial killers, a disturbing but well-documented subset of homicide, have identified certain recurring characteristics, and several of them are visible in the profile that Zelenka's case assembles. The first is the intoxication of power. In medical and nursing environments, the proximity to life and death creates a unique power dynamic. The nurse or doctor who administers a drug that saves a life has exercised an extraordinary form of power, the power to preserve a human existence. But this power can, in certain psychologically fragile configurations, become addictive in a distorted way. The individual comes to crave not just the experience of saving, but the experience of controlling the outcome entirely, including controlling it in the direction of death. The capacity to cause what they then respond to becomes, in this framework, the ultimate expression of their own significance. Zelenka's claimed desire to see some action, one of several explanations he offered at various points, all of them shifting with the inconsistency of someone who has not committed to any single narrative, suggests this kind of compulsive seeking after intensity. Hospital environments can be monotonous for staff, particularly on quiet overnight shifts. The grinding routine of institutional care, the sense of being a minor functionary in a large system, the absence of drama, for someone with Zelenka's apparent psychological disposition, these conditions may have created a restlessness that could only be relieved by manufacturing crisis, by introducing the emergency that would then demand response, by inserting himself as the hidden origin point of events that would otherwise have remained ordinary. There is also the question of how he perceived his victim's humanity. Forensic psychologists who study offenders who harm within caregiving contexts often identify a process of dehumanization, not the violent, rage-fueled dehumanization of the hate crime, but something more clinical and perhaps more insidious, a gradual flattening of the patient's personhood into a category. The elderly, the critically ill, the chronically vulnerable. These are populations that certain minds learn to perceive as already halfway between the living and the dead, already departing, already less substantial, less present, less weighted with the full freight of human value. This is not a reflection of reality. It is a cognitive distortion, but it is one that can render the act of harming them psychologically smoother, less cognitively dissonant, than harming someone perceived as fully, vibrantly alive. Whether Zelenka consciously operated from this distortion or whether it was a more implicit feature of his orientation toward his patients is impossible to determine with certainty. What is documented is the pattern of his targeting. Overwhelmingly elderly patients, predominantly those already in critical condition. He was not approaching patients who were ambulatory, alert, and capable of advocating for themselves. He was approaching the ones who were already most diminished, most dependent, most unable to resist or report. His behavior during the investigation revealed further psychological complexity. The shifting confessions, admitting to 5 deaths, denying the other 2, claiming police coercion for the denied admissions. Speak to a man who was managing his own narrative with some care even in the midst of exposure. He was not simply collapsing under the weight of guilt. He was negotiating, selecting which elements of the truth he was willing to acknowledge and constructing a version of events that served whatever internal purpose he was attempting to preserve. Whether that purpose was legal minimization, psychological self-protection, or simply the maintenance of control in a situation that had stripped most of his other forms of it is a matter that observers interpreted differently. His demeanor in court was noted by journalists present at the proceedings. He was described as controlled, largely impassive, a man who sat through the testimony of forensic experts, through the recounting of his victims' suffering, through the grief of their families, without the kind of visible emotional response that onlookers tend to expect. This is not, in itself, definitive evidence of anything. Courtroom composure can reflect many things, from stoicism to calculation to genuine emotional dysregulation. But in the context of everything else known about Zelenka, it contributed to a portrait of a man who occupied his interior world largely independently of the suffering happening around him. His lawyer's argument for diminished responsibility, the claim that Zelenka was mentally ill in a way that should reduce his culpability and his sentence, was constructed around this psychological profile. The argument essentially asked the court to see in Zelenka's behavior the evidence of a disordered mind, a man whose grip on moral reality had been compromised by illness rather than simply abandoned by choice. It was an argument that had some purchase in the medical literature on healthcare killers, where the line between compulsion and choice is genuinely contested terrain. The court rejected it. Judge Yuri Vasek, presiding over the proceedings in Hradec Králové, made clear that the evidence presented did not support a finding that reduced criminal responsibility was warranted. The pattern of Zelenka's behavior, the concealment of the heparin vial, the covert administration, the exploitation of shift-based privacy, the selection of victims unlikely to be able to report the injection, was too deliberate, too strategically designed to evade detection, to be characterized as the product of a mind so disorganized that it could not appreciate the nature or consequences of its own actions. You cannot carefully conceal your weapon and carefully select your moments and carefully maintain your composure over a period of 7 months, and then credibly claim that your judgment was so impaired as to mitigate your culpability. The systematic nature of the behavior was itself evidence against the diminished responsibility argument. It spoke not of a fractured mind but of a functioning one, oriented toward a terrible purpose. It is worth dwelling here on the particular cruelty of the method Zelenka chose, not from a place of sensationalism, but because the choice of method illuminates something important about the perpetrator's relationship to his crimes. He could have chosen other means. He had access to a variety of pharmaceutical agents in his role as a nurse. The selection of heparin specifically, an anticoagulant that causes death through internal hemorrhage, through the body's own blood becoming its undoing, suggests either a considered calculation about deniability or a specific fascination with that particular mechanism of harm. Possibly both. Internal hemorrhage is not a peaceful death. The body does not simply switch off. As blood pools in the cavities of the abdomen and chest, as pressure builds around organs, as the cardiovascular system desperately attempts to compensate for the volume loss that is accumulating invisibly within the patient's own body, the experience is one of progressive physiological collapse. Falling blood pressure, rising heart rate, the confusion and restlessness that accompanies inadequate oxygen delivery to the brain, pain where the accumulating blood presses against structures that were not designed to accommodate it. For patients who were conscious or partially conscious during these episodes, and some were, the experience was one of physical distress without comprehension of its cause. They were dying from something they could not see, caused by something no one had told them about, inflicted by someone whose role was to prevent exactly this. The survivors of Zelenka's attacks, those 10 individuals whose bodies resisted long enough for emergency intervention to reverse the hemorrhagic process, carry the knowledge of what happened to them in ways that are not simply physical. Some learned the truth only when the investigation became public. Some had to reconstruct, retroactively, the experience they had lived through and reframe it not as a frightening medical episode but as a deliberate attempt on their lives by the nurse who had stood beside their bed. The psychological dimensions of that realization, the betrayal of trust at the most intimate and vulnerable moment of their lives, are not easily quantified. The families of the 7 who died confronted a different version of the same reframing. Grief that had been processed as the grief of natural, if untimely, loss now had to be re-understood as grief for a murder. The death that they had mourned, the death they had perhaps accepted as the inevitable conclusion of serious illness, was not what it had appeared to be. Someone had made a decision. Someone had acted deliberately. Their person had not simply died. Their person had been killed. The distinction is not merely semantic. It transforms the entire emotional and psychological landscape of bereavement. Petr Zelenka, sitting in his cell in the months before the trial, had none of this to contend with on his behalf. He had, apparently, a relatively stable capacity to occupy his own experience without the kind of destabilizing guilt that typically accompanies the acknowledgement of catastrophic harm to others. Whether this reflected a genuine absence of empathy, a psychological defense mechanism of extraordinary robustness, or something else entirely, it was consistent with the profile that had been assembling itself from the beginning. A man who had moved through 7 months of deliberate killing with the outward composure of someone doing his job. The trial of Petr Zelenka opened before the court in Hradec Králové in early 2008 and immediately occupied the center of national attention in a way that few criminal proceedings in Czech history had managed. This was not merely a murder trial. It was a reckoning with something that went beyond the individual in the dock and implicated institutions, professions, and the fundamental assumptions upon which ordinary citizens rest their sense of safety when they seek medical care. The courtroom in Hradec Králové was not large enough to contain the public appetite for answers, and the media coverage that surrounded the proceedings reflected the depth of the disquiet that Zelenka's crimes had generated. He arrived on the first day of proceedings with the same controlled composure that had characterized his behavior since his arrest. He pleaded guilty to 5 of the 7 murders he was charged with, maintaining his denial regarding the remaining 2 deaths, and his insistence that confessions pertaining to those 2 had been extracted through police coercion. It was a position that positioned him as simultaneously willing to accept partial responsibility and determined to preserve a zone of deniability, a negotiated relationship with the truth that prosecutors and investigators found wholly unconvincing. The prosecution's case rested on a combination of forensic toxicology, statistical analysis of patient outcomes, staff scheduling records, and the testimony of medical experts who had reviewed the circumstances of each death and near-fatal incident in the intensive care unit during the relevant period. The forensic evidence was perhaps the most powerful component. The presence of heparin at overdose levels in biological samples from victims, the complete absence of any clinical order or chart entry justifying those heparin levels, the pharmacological analysis confirming that the concentrations found were consistent with deliberate overdose rather than any plausible clinical explanation. Experts testified to the mechanism of heparin toxicity in language that the court and the attending public could understand, describing in clinical but unsparing terms the internal hemorrhage that the drug had caused and the experience of dying from it. The defense attempted to introduce doubt through multiple avenues. The claim of police coercion regarding the 2 disputed confessions was one angle. The diminished responsibility argument was another, supported by psychiatric testimony suggesting that Zelenka's psychological profile reflected a disordered personality with impaired insight and impulse control. Expert witnesses for the defense argued that the mental health component of the case warranted consideration in sentencing even if full acquittal was not appropriate. They pointed to the incoherence of his stated motives. The shifting between testing the doctors and wanting to see action, and not knowing why, as evidence of a fragmented psychological state rather than the calculated planning of a fully culpable offender. The prosecution rejected this framing with force. The pattern of behavior, they argued, was the evidence. You do not conceal a vial of medication from view by accident. You do not wait for the precise window of low supervision and then approach a specific patient and administer a covert injection by impulse alone. You do not do this 17 times across a period of 7 months without the operational consistency of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and has decided to keep doing it. The very elements of the behavior that Zelenka's defense team characterized as evidence of psychological disorder. The inexplicability of the motive, the apparent absence of personal animus toward victims, were reframed by the prosecution as evidence of the predatory detachment of someone to whom other human beings were simply not real in the way that they are real to most people. Judge Vasic delivered the verdict in February 2008. Guilty on all 7 counts of murder. Guilty on the 10 counts of attempted murder. The finding rejected the diminished responsibility argument in its entirety and accepted the prosecution's characterization of Zelenka's crimes as deliberate, systematic, and fully attributable to a functioning criminal will. The sentence was life imprisonment. Petr Zelenka would not leave prison. He would not be eligible for parole under standard mechanisms. He would live out his remaining years behind the walls of a maximum security facility, the 34th individual in the Czech Republic to receive a life sentence. Judge Vasic, in his remarks accompanying the sentence, made a statement that reverberated through the Czech press and public with considerable force. He indicated explicitly that had the death penalty remained available as a sentencing option in Czech law, it had been abolished in 1990, he would have imposed it on Petr Zelenka. This was not a routine judicial comment. It was a direct statement about the court's assessment of the gravity and irredeemability of what Zelenka had done. It was the judge placing this case in the absolute register of criminal culpability and saying, as plainly as judicial language permits, that the person standing before the court represented the outer limit of what the law was designed to punish. Zelenka received the sentence without visible collapse. Journalists present reported that he bowed his head as the verdict was delivered and showed no emotional response as Judge Vasic spoke. Afterwards, standing with his lawyer, he was seen wiping tears from his eyes, the first visible crack in the composure that had held throughout the proceedings. Whether those tears represented genuine grief, personal devastation at the reality of his sentence, or something else, no one could know with certainty. They were, simply, the one moment of visible emotion from a man who had given almost nothing away. The families of the 7 murdered patients, and the survivors among the 10 who had been attacked, received the verdict with the complicated, exhausted relief that characterizes the conclusion of long legal proceedings in cases of profound loss. There was no joy in what had happened. There could not be. The verdict named the truth and attached consequences to it, and that matters. But naming the truth did not restore any of what had been taken. The 7 people who had died in that intensive care ward, who had arrived at that hospital in good faith and been killed there by the person tasked with their care, remained dead. The 10 who had survived carried the experience of near death at the hands of a trusted professional in ways that did not evaporate with the reading of a verdict. The institutional consequences extended well beyond the courtroom. The hospital's director had already been dismissed for the delay in acting on the patterns that should have triggered investigation months earlier than they did. The Czech Health Ministry established a special investigative committee to examine the case and its systemic implications. Healthcare professionals and patient advocacy groups entered into a sustained and sometimes fractious public debate about the adequacy of oversight in Czech hospital settings, about whether the systems in place for identifying and responding to anomalous patient outcomes were sufficient, whether the culture of professional solidarity and institutional protectionism that had possibly contributed to the delay in addressing Zelenka's behavior needed reform, and about what structural safeguards could reasonably be implemented to reduce the possibility of a similar case arising. These debates were not resolved cleanly or quickly. The nature of healthcare delivery creates inherent tensions between the need for oversight and the practical realities of understaffed, overworked clinical environments. One representative of Czech patients' rights organizations characterized the case as an indictment of systemic failures, an illustration of what happens when internal checks are too weak to catch a determined bad actor operating from within. Another healthcare reform advocate pushed back on this characterization, arguing that no set of safety protocols could provide absolute protection against an individual who was sufficiently trusted, sufficiently knowledgeable, and sufficiently committed to concealment. Both positions contained genuine insight. Neither offered complete resolution. The media coverage of the case in the Czech Republic and internationally played a significant role in shaping public understanding of what had happened, but it also brought with it a particular challenge: how to report on the actions of a healthcare serial killer in a way that informed the public without unnecessarily amplifying fear of the very institutions on which people depend for their survival. The coverage in Czech print and broadcast media was, at times, searingly critical of the hospital administration and the healthcare system's response. At other times, it grappled with the question of how to represent the victims as full human beings rather than simply as counts in an indictment. Some Czech medical professionals disputed aspects of the case's forensic foundations in the years following the verdict. A small number of doctors raised questions about whether heparin overdose, in the context of already critically ill patients, could definitively be established as the cause of death to the exclusion of other explanations arising from the patient's underlying conditions. These dissenting voices did not represent mainstream medical opinion on the case, and the courts had heard expert testimony addressing precisely these evidentiary questions. But their existence illustrated the complexity of forensic medicine in cases involving patients who are already gravely ill, the difficulty of establishing with absolute certainty the proximate cause of death in a body already fighting on multiple fronts. Zelenka himself, from within the prison system, remained a figure of lingering public fascination and revulsion. He continued to maintain aspects of his denial, particularly regarding the 2 deaths to which he had never confessed. He did not, as far as public information extends, engage in any extended public reckoning with his crimes of the kind that some imprisoned killers undertake. The memoir, the interview, the attempt at explanation that might serve as a kind of posthumous self-accounting. He remained, in this sense, as he had been throughout, opaque. A figure whose interior life had never been fully accessible, whose stated motives had always been insufficient to account for the magnitude of what he had done, and whose presence in the national consciousness was as a marker of a particular kind of institutional horror, the horror of trust violated at its most fundamental. The case of Petr Zelenka became a reference point in Czech criminal history in a way that few individual cases do. Not simply as the act of one disturbed individual, but as a case study in how the architecture of trust that holds institutions together can be exploited from within, and in how long it can take for that exploitation to become visible when it is conducted by someone who understands the architecture intimately. It entered the academic literature on healthcare serial killers, joining a small but deeply troubling catalog of cases from around the world. Harold Shipman in the United Kingdom, Janine Jones in the United States, Niels Hogel in Germany, in which individuals embedded within medical systems used their access to pharmaceutical agents to harm and kill the patients who depended on them. Each of those cases carries its own specific horror, its own specific set of systemic failures and institutional blindnesses. What they share is the violation of the most fundamental covenant in human life. The agreement that those who hold power over the vulnerable will use that power only for protection. When that covenant breaks, it breaks not just for the individual victims but for everyone who encounters the institution afterward, everyone who lies down in a hospital bed and wonders, in a corner of their consciousness that most of us keep carefully closed, whether the person approaching with a syringe is there to help. That is the wound that Petr Zelenka left in the world. Not just the 7 graves, not just the 10 survivors who carry the mark of what they endured, but the shadow cast across every hospital bed, every midnight ward round, every quiet moment when a patient lies alone and trusts the institution with everything they have. He did not invent that shadow, but he fed it. He made it larger and darker and harder to ignore. And then he went to prison, and the shadow remained. In the maximum security facility where Zelenka now lives out his sentence, the days pass in the way that days pass in such places, defined by restriction, by routine, by the absence of the freedom and authority he once possessed. He is the 34th individual serving a life sentence in the Czech Republic. He is, by the court's finding, the worst serial killer the country has produced in its post-communist era. He is a name that appears in academic papers on forensic nursing, in chapters on healthcare predators, in the case files of investigators who study how institutions fail to protect the people inside them. The patients he killed cannot read those papers. The families he shattered cannot be made whole by the verdict. The 10 survivors carry knowledge in their bodies that no legal outcome reverses. And somewhere in the Bohemian Moravian highlands, in a city where a regional hospital once stood for the ordinary human promise of healing, there are people who remember the nurse in the white uniform, the quiet one who kept to himself, the one who carried a hidden vial through the corridors of a ward where people were fighting to live. They remember him, and they wonder how long he walked among them before anyone thought to look. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Ghost of Skid Row. The Skid Row Stabber, aka Luther, the Soul Collector. He moved through the darkest streets in America like a shadow with a knife, and nobody saw his face. Before the Hillside Strangler stole the headlines, before the Night Stalker made Los Angeles tremble in its sleep, there was something else already moving through the city's forgotten gutters, something quieter, something that chose victims the world had already decided didn't matter. Picture a city that never sleeps. Neon-drenched, loud, glittering on the surface, and then picture what lies just beneath that glitter. For square blocks, broken concrete, the smell of rot and misery baked into the pavement. Men sleeping on flattened cardboard, wrapped in layers of filth, breathing shallow breaths in October cold, completely exposed, completely alone. Now picture a figure moving through that darkness. Unhurried, deliberate, almost gentle in his approach. And a blade catching no light because he is careful, so terribly careful. He does not run. He does not scream. He moves between one sleeping body and the next like a thought passing through a sick mind. By the time the sun climbs over downtown Los Angeles and the first sanitation workers start their rounds, there is blood pooling in the cracks of the alley floor. And somewhere in that vast, indifferent city, a man is already planning where he will go next. 11 human beings. 11 lives already scraped down to almost nothing by poverty, addiction, and abandonment. And then a blade finished what the streets had started. He called himself Luther. The world called him the Skid Row Stabber. And to this day, no one truly knows who he was. Welcome. Stay close, because this story is going to follow you home. Los Angeles in 1978 was a city drowning in its own mythology. On the west side, the rich were building swimming pools and dining beneath palm trees and telling themselves that this was paradise. In the hills, a pair of monstrous men were already strangling women and disposing of bodies along the roadside. The Hillside Strangler case was consuming the LAPD, the newspapers, and the public imagination. Every morning brought fresh terror for the comfortable residents of the hills and suburbs. Police task forces were assembled. Resources were poured in. The city held its breath. And 4 blocks east of City Hall, in the neighborhood that the rest of Los Angeles had quietly agreed to pretend did not exist, a different predator was already at work. Skid Row. The very name carries a weight that words struggle to hold. By the late 1970s, it was already the most concentrated pocket of street homelessness in the entire United States. An estimated 8,000 to 10,000 people lived, slept, ate, wept, and died within those few square blocks. They were human beings, veterans, the mentally ill, men broken by factory closures and crumbling marriages, men whose addictions had eaten everything they once were. But the city of Los Angeles had decided, quietly and collectively, that their suffering was simply the cost of doing business. The police patrolled Skid Row the way you patrol a zoo, not to protect the inhabitants, but to keep them contained. Into this forgotten world, on the morning of October 23, 1978, a body appeared. His name was Jesse Martinez. He was 50 years old. He had been a cook, a working man, not a transient, though circumstance had placed him that night in the wrong alley on the wrong side of the city. He was discovered in a narrow alleyway at the intersection of 5th and Wall Streets, his body punctured by stab wounds that suggested not a robbery gone wrong, not a drunken fight, but something far more purposeful, far more cold. The wounds were deep, targeted, and numerous. Whoever had done this had not panicked. Whoever had done this had taken their time. The investigators noted it. They filed it. They moved on. 6 days later, on October 29th, 32-year-old Jose Cortez was found dead in an alley off East 3rd Street. The cause of death was the same: multiple stab wounds, methodical, devastating. Cortez was homeless. He had no fixed address. He had no one filing missing persons reports. The city found him when the smell became impossible to ignore. The very next day, October 30th, 46-year-old Bruce Emmett Drake was found on South Kohler Street, stabbed, left in the open. No witnesses, no struggle marks suggesting he had run, or fought back, or even had the chance to cry out. The attack had been fast, and it had been efficient, and it had ended a man's life with the kind of practiced brutality that belongs to someone who has done this before, or who has rehearsed it so thoroughly in the theater of their own mind that the real thing came naturally. 3 men dead in 8 days. 3 stabbings within 4 blocks of each other. 3 victims from the most vulnerable population in the city. And Los Angeles barely blinked. There were no press conferences, no emergency task forces, no mayoral statements of grief or outrage. The Hillside Strangler was still dominating the headlines, and the victims of that case were young women from neighborhoods where cameras went willingly. The men dying on Skid Row did not generate the same urgency. The unspoken logic of the era, brutal, shameful, but real, was that the homeless were already living a kind of death, and that their murders were a tragedy only in the technical sense of the word. November arrived, and the blade did not rest. On November 4th, 65-year-old J.P. Henderson was found dead, killed in the same brutal, unmistakable manner. He was the oldest victim yet, a man who had somehow survived 6.5 decades of life on this earth, only to be extinguished on a sidewalk in downtown Los Angeles, his body discovered by strangers who had no idea who he was. 5 days later, the killer made what would become the most significant move of his entire campaign. On November 9th, 39-year-old David Martin Jones was attacked and killed near the downtown public library, just steps from Los Angeles City Hall. And this one single time, there were witnesses. 3 men, 3 companions of the deceased, fellow residents of Skid Row, who had been standing nearby when a stranger approached their group. What made this moment chilling, truly deeply chilling, was the way the stranger arrived. He did not skulk. He did not lurk in shadows or emerge from a darkened doorway. He walked up to the group, calm as Sunday morning, and he introduced himself. His name, he said, was Luther. The witnesses described him carefully to the police. A black man, approximately 30 years old, heavy-set, standing close to 6 feet tall, clean-shaven, soft-spoken. He walked with an unusual, slow, deliberate gait, as though he were measuring each step, as though movement itself was something he had mastered and chose to use sparingly. He had a Puerto Rican accent, or what the men perceived as one. He was dressed neatly enough that he did not appear to be a Skid Row resident himself. He looked like someone passing through, visiting, surveying. He chatted with the group for several minutes, made small talk, asked questions, was pleasant, was human, was utterly, devastatingly ordinary. And then he pulled a knife and buried it in David Martin Jones. The attack was explosive after all that gentleness. A sudden detonation of violence that left Jones dying on the ground and the 3 witnesses paralyzed with shock. By the time they gathered themselves enough to call for help, Luther had dissolved back into the city. No one chased him. No one could have. He moved with the calm efficiency of a man who had already planned his exit before he'd said his first word. The description was circulated. The LAPD took it seriously. This was the first real portrait anyone had managed to paint of the figure leaving bodies in the alleyways. But the city was enormous, and a heavy-set black man with a slow walk and a soft voice was not a description narrow enough to make an arrest. The killing continued. On November 10th, the very next day after the murder of David Jones, the Skid Row stabber committed a double killing. 2 men murdered in one night. 36-year-old Frank Floyd Reed and 49-year-old Augustine E. Luna. Their bodies were found in the pre-dawn hours, cooling in the autumn air. 2 lives ended back-to-back with the same blade in the same ruthless manner. The killer had accelerated. Or perhaps he had always been capable of this. Perhaps the single killings had simply been the warm-up, the practice, and this was the real expression of whatever darkness drove him. The newspapers, slowly, reluctantly, were beginning to pay attention. By now, the pattern was impossible to dismiss even for those who wished to. All of the victims were men. All were homeless or near homeless. All had been stabbed. Not shot, not strangled, not bludgeoned, but stabbed with a blade of consistent width and length, suggesting the same weapon used again and again. All of the bodies had been left within a tightly compressed geographic area, a radius of perhaps 4 city blocks. The killer was not ranging widely. He was not hunting across the city. He had a territory, He had a preferred hunting ground, and he knew it intimately. The LAPD formed a task force. It was smaller and far less funded than the one chasing the hillside strangler, but it existed. Detectives began working the neighborhood, pressing contacts, interviewing anyone willing to speak. On Skid Row, speaking to police was not something most residents did willingly. The relationship between law enforcement and the unhoused was built on a foundation of harassment, suspicion, and mutual contempt. Getting useful information out of people who had every reason to distrust badges was like drawing water from concrete. The killer, meanwhile, was moving among them like a resident, like a familiar face. He had spoken to those 3 witnesses for several minutes without raising a single alarm bell. He had stood in their circle, breathed their air, used their names, and not one of them had felt the faintest tremor of danger until the knife was already moving. That was perhaps the most terrifying thing about him. Not the violence, but the ease. Not the blade, but the smile before it. Luther had found his city, and he wasn't finished. There is a particular kind of dread that settles over a community when it realizes that something is hunting it. Not a random flash of violence. Not the ordinary chaos of a neighborhood where poverty and desperation create daily danger, but something deliberate, something patient, something that comes back. By mid-November of 1978, the residents of Skid Row felt it. They could not name it cleanly, not yet, because names require the authority that only the press and the police can grant. But they felt it in the way they looked over their shoulders before closing their eyes at night. They felt it in the tight clusters of people who chose not to sleep alone anymore, pressing themselves together in doorways and under awnings, as though the warmth of another body was any kind of protection against what was moving in the dark. On November 17th, 34-year-old Milford Fletcher was killed. Fletcher was Native American, a detail that would be recorded faithfully in the official victim list, but which would receive almost no attention in the press coverage. He was simply the next name added to a growing column of the dead. His killing bore all the same signatures as the ones before it: the deep, repeated stab wounds, the absence of any apparent robbery motive, the body left in the open without any attempt at concealment. The killer was not hiding his work. He was not ashamed of it. He was, in some cold and inexplicable way, presenting it. 3 days later, November 20th, 45-year-old Frank Garcia was killed. His body was not discovered immediately. It was found on November 23rd, near City Hall, in one of the most unnerving locations yet chosen by the killer. City Hall, the seat of the Los Angeles city government. One of the most public, most visible, most populated civic spaces in the entire city. People worked there, walked past it, ate their lunches on the steps. And on November 23rd, a man's body was found near its shadow, torn open by a blade, lying in the kind of posed abandonment that suggested either recklessness or arrogance, and possibly both. What made this discovery even more disturbing was what the investigators found near Garcia's body: a handprint, a partial palm print pressed into a surface near the body, clear enough to be cataloged and preserved. The forensic team collected it carefully. At the time, there was no match in any database. But the print was there, a physical signature left by the killer, whether deliberately or through momentary carelessness, and it would become the single most important piece of physical evidence in a case that would eventually be defined by the near-total absence of such things. The murder of Frank Garcia generated a different quality of attention than the killings that had preceded it. The proximity to City Hall made it impossible for officials to maintain comfortable distance from the story. This was not just a Skid Row problem anymore. This was a downtown Los Angeles problem. This was a problem visible from the windows of people who had offices, who ate at restaurants, who drove home to neighborhoods with gates. And so, finally, the city began to scream. The newspapers gave the killer a name: the Skid Row Stabber. It was a blunt name, journalistic shorthand that reduced a string of devastating murders to a geographic punchline, but it was the name that stuck. Within days, it was on every front page that bothered to cover the story, which was more front pages than had bothered before. The LAPD felt the heat intensify. The task force expanded. Detectives who had been quietly working the case now had the uncomfortable awareness that people were watching, measuring, waiting for an arrest. But there was no arrest to make. Because the Skid Row stabber was extraordinarily careful, and he was extraordinarily fortunate, and in the absence of any other explanation, he seemed to be extraordinarily invisible. Consider the evidence picture at this point in November 1978. 8 victims. Not a single surviving eyewitness from most of the crime scenes. Not a single piece of forensic evidence aside from that one handprint near Garcia's body. The 3 men who had watched David Jones die had given a description. Luther, heavyset, slow walk, Puerto Rican accent, but that description had not produced any leads. The killer left no murder weapon. He left no footprints. He left no threads of clothing snagged on rough walls. In the language of forensic investigation, he was leaving almost nothing. What he was leaving was the bodies themselves. And the bodies told a story if you knew how to read them. The stab wounds were consistent across victims. Delivered with force, directed toward the torso and vital organs, multiple in number, suggesting not just a desire to kill but a commitment to ensuring the kill. Medical examiners noted that the wounds showed no hesitation marks, no exploratory cuts, nothing that would indicate uncertainty or amateur execution. This was not someone stabbing out of panic. This was not a drug addict committing violence for the next fix. The wounds were the work of someone who understood what a blade could do and applied that understanding without flinching. The victims were almost exclusively sleeping or incapacitated when attacked. This was not a killer who challenged his prey. There was no evidence of prolonged struggle. The men of Skid Row, exhausted, often intoxicated, sleeping in the only places available to them, exposed doorways, alley floors, parking lot corners, were caught completely without warning. The first sensation many of them likely experienced was the blade itself. Some may never have awakened at all. This is the element of the Skid Row stabber case that sits heaviest in the chest when you spend time with it. The profound vulnerability of the victims. The absolute absence of any defense. These were men who had already been stripped of everything: housing, stability, connection, dignity, and they had adapted to that stripping by building tiny, precarious routines of survival. A familiar doorway, a regular spot, a cluster of people nearby who would notice if you didn't appear in the morning. And against those fragile, painstaking adaptations, the Skid Row stabber moved with devastating efficiency. He targeted the isolation. He exploited the invisibility. He chose people who the rest of the world had already made invisible, and he made them permanently so. On November 17th, he had killed Milford Fletcher. On November 20th or thereabouts, he had killed Frank Garcia. And now, in the final days of November, the people of Skid Row were doing something that the rest of Los Angeles had not yet fully registered. They were afraid. They were afraid in the specific, exhausting way that people are afraid when the danger is real, constant, and aimed directly at them. They could not leave. They had nowhere else to go. They could not call for better police protection in any way that would be heard. They were trapped in a geography that had become a killing field, watched over by a figure who knew their routines better than the police ever would. Inside the LAPD, pressure was mounting at a volume the department could no longer deflect. 2 suspects had already been arrested and released for lack of evidence. Detectives were running down every lead, every description, every fragment of testimony available to them, and coming back empty-handed. The handprint from the Garcia scene had not matched anyone on file. The description of Luther had not produced any viable person to investigate. And then, in December 1978, something happened that seemed to shift the whole landscape of the investigation. A patrol officer encountered a man standing over a sleeping homeless person on a Skid Row sidewalk in the middle of the night. The man was holding a knife. He was not running. He was not attacking, not at that precise moment. But he was standing over a sleeping, defenseless man with a blade in his hand. And when the officer approached, the man did not explain himself in any convincing way. His name was Bobby Joe Maxwell. He was 28 years old. He had moved to Los Angeles from Tennessee not long before, after serving time in prison for armed robbery. He worked casual labor jobs and spent his free hours in and around Skid Row. He was arrested, charged with disturbing the peace, and the knife was confiscated. He spent several weeks in county jail. And while Bobby Joe Maxwell sat in a jail cell, the Skid Row stabber committed no murders. Not one. The streets were quiet. The bodies stopped appearing. The task force noted it with the kind of cautious, electric excitement that investigators feel when coincidence begins to smell like evidence. They held their breath. They waited. Bobby Joe Maxwell was released from jail 3 days before the last known victim of the Skid Row stabber was found dead. The investigators exhaled. They had their man, or they believed they did. The truth, as this story will reveal in full measure, was something far darker, far more complicated, and far more painful than a simple arrest. January 21st, 1979, a Sunday. The winter air over Los Angeles had the particular gray chill that descends on Southern California in its coldest months. Not brutal, not Arctic, but biting enough to cut through thin clothing and drive people deeper into doorways and under awnings. On that morning, 26-year-old Luis Alvarez became the 11th and final confirmed victim of the Skid Row stabber. He was the youngest of all the victims, 26 years old. Young enough to have had whole chapters of life still unwritten. Young enough that the distance between his current circumstances and a different life might still have been crossable, given time, given help, given luck. He received none of those things. What he received was a blade in the pre-dawn darkness of Skid Row, and a death that was reported with the same procedural brevity as the 10 that had come before it. Luis Alvarez died the way the others had died. Rapidly, violently, without the dignity of a proper farewell. His body was left where it fell. The alley did not care. The cold did not care. And at that moment, in a county jail across the city, Bobby Joe Maxwell was either the man responsible for this act or an innocent person who had the catastrophic misfortune of fitting the silhouette of suspicion. That question, that agonizing, infuriating question, would take 40 years to be addressed by the legal system. And by the time the system got around to answering it, the man at the center of the question was already dying. But we are not there yet. We are in January 1979, and the city is counting its dead, and 3 months after the murder of David Martin Jones, something appeared in a public restroom at the Los Angeles bus terminal that made every detective on the Skid Row task force stop breathing for a moment. Someone had written on the wall, in crude, deliberate lettering, pressed into the surface of a bathroom stall in the kind of permanent marker that announces an intention. Not a passing thought, not an impulse, but a considered statement. The following words were found. My name is Luther. I kill winos. I put them out of their misery. Read that sentence again. Not quickly. Let each word settle. My name is Luther. An identity, announced with the calm of someone who sees no need to hide. I kill winos. Not I have killed. Present tense. Ongoing. Continuous. As though it were a profession, a vocation, a defining characteristic rather than a secret. I put them out of their misery. The killer's justification, the philosophical architecture that allowed whatever lived inside this person to frame mass murder not as crime, not as cruelty, but as mercy. As service rendered to men whose suffering he had decided was intolerable. This was not the writing of someone gripped by guilt. This was not a confession born from the need for relief. This was a declaration. The Skid Row stabber, Luther, as he chose to call himself, was telling the city that he had done this, that he had reasons, and that he was not done with those reasons yet. The note was analyzed by handwriting experts. It was photographed, preserved, examined. It became one of the central pieces of evidence in the case that was building around Bobby Joe Maxwell. Because the prosecution would later claim, through expert testimony, that the handwriting on that bathroom wall matched samples taken from Maxwell. The defense would dispute this. The appeals courts would eventually find the entire evidentiary structure of the case deeply unreliable. But in the spring of 1979, the note was treated as a near confession, a thread connecting the name Luther to the man the LAPD believed had been standing over a sleeping homeless man with a knife just weeks before the final murder. On April 4, 1979, Bobby Joe Maxwell was arrested at an old movie theater in downtown Los Angeles. He was 28 years old, unemployed, recently released from jail, known to spend time in Skid Row. The LAPD charged him with the murders of 10 homeless men. The Skid Row stabber had, they announced, been apprehended. The press ran with it. The public exhaled. 11 murders, 1 arrest, case closed. Los Angeles could move on. Except that the evidence against Bobby Joe Maxwell was, from the very beginning, threadbare in ways that the announcement of his arrest did not convey. Consider what the prosecution actually had. 1 partial palm print, found near the body of Frank Garcia at City Hall, a location where Maxwell was known to frequent, which the defense would argue was as meaningful as finding someone's fingerprint in a coffee shop they visited regularly. 1 knife seized during his December arrest, which had blade dimensions consistent with the weapon used in the murders, but which was a common type of folding knife, the sort carried by hundreds of thousands of men across Los Angeles. 1 note on a bathroom wall, supposedly matched to his handwriting by expert testimony that was, in fact, deeply contested. The testimony of 3 witnesses to David Jones' murder, except those witnesses had described Luther as a man with a Puerto Rican accent, and Maxwell was from Tennessee, and none of them could identify him with any certainty. And then there was Sidney Storch. Sidney Storch was a jailhouse informant, a man with a documented history of fabrication, manipulation, and the kind of opportunistic dishonesty that prison environments produce and reward. He had been Maxwell's cellmate for 3 weeks. He came forward to prosecutors with a remarkable story. Maxwell, he claimed, had confessed to the killings in detail, had explained exactly how he'd done it, had even mentioned, Storch said, that he had forgotten to wear gloves during the killing near City Hall, which is why the handprint was there. It was a perfect confession. Too perfect. The sort of specific case-solving detail that investigators pray for and that, in retrospect, should have raised every alarm bell available to trained investigators. Because how would an inmate know the precise detail about the handprint? Why would a killer, careful enough to leave almost no physical evidence across 10 murders, suddenly confide the most incriminating detail of his entire spree to a stranger in a jail cell? The answer, which would not fully emerge for decades, was that Sidney Storch had read about the handprint in the newspapers. He was, by this point in his career, a practiced and sophisticated consumer of high-profile case journalism, and he had long since mastered the art of absorbing published details and presenting them as private confidences. He had done it before. He would do it again. The Los Angeles County justice system in the 1980s operated with a jailhouse informant culture that was, to use the eventual language of the Federal Appeals Court, shot through with corruption, fabrication, and the systematic betrayal of innocent men. Bobby Joe Maxwell's trial began in 1984. 5 years after his arrest, 5 years of pretrial proceedings, continuances, and legal maneuvering. It lasted 9 months. The jury deliberated for 25 days. The longest deliberation in Los Angeles County history at that time. A number that speaks volumes about the jury's uncertainty, their genuine struggle to reconcile the enormity of the charges with the thinness of the proof. When the verdicts finally came, they were a mosaic of conviction, acquittal, and irresolution. Maxwell was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was acquitted of 3 others. 5 more counts. 5 more murdered men. Produced mistrials, meaning the jury could not agree on his guilt or innocence even after 25 days of deliberation. 2 convictions out of 10 charges. It was not the decisive verdict the prosecution had sought, but it was enough. Under California law, the special circumstances attached to the guilty verdicts placed Maxwell in death penalty territory. The jury chose life without parole over execution, and Bobby Joe Maxwell was taken from the courtroom and delivered to the California state prison system to serve that sentence for the remainder of his natural life. He was 33 years old. He would not walk free for the rest of his life. Whether he was the Skid Row stabber or an innocent man in the wrong place at the worst possible time, that question on the day of sentencing appeared to be settled. It was not settled. Not by a long way. Meanwhile, on the streets of Skid Row, quieter now, at least in terms of body count, the true author of those 11 murders, if it was not Bobby Joe Maxwell, was somewhere in the city. Somewhere alive. Somewhere watching the news coverage of the conviction and reading Bobby Joe Maxwell's name where their own name should have appeared. If it wasn't Bobby Joe Maxwell, then whoever Luther really was, whoever held that knife on 11 mornings and 11 nights in the autumn and winter of 1978, was a free man. He has remained free ever since. There is a particular kind of cruelty in the mechanics of a wrongful conviction that goes beyond the simple arithmetic of years lost. It is the cruelty of a system that takes a man's protests of innocence and records them, faithfully, as evidence of his guilt. Every appeal is a denial of accountability. Every refusal to confess is a hardness of character. Every year of maintained innocence is simply more time in which to be made compliant. Bobby Joe Maxwell maintained his innocence from the first day of his arrest in 1979 until the day he fell into a coma in 2017. For 38 years, he told anyone who would listen that he had not killed those men. He filed appeal after appeal, each one denied. Each denial another closed door in a corridor that seemed to have no end. He aged inside California's prison system, his body wearing down under the weight of institutionalization, his case gathering dust in filing cabinets while the city that had convicted him moved on to other outrages, other monsters, other headlines. The world outside continued turning. Los Angeles produced new nightmares to replace the old ones. The Night Stalker arrived and terrorized the city through 1984 and 1985, and the resources and attention that had once been focused on Skid Row were entirely consumed by Richard Ramirez's campaign of home invasions and murder. The Skid Row stabber became historical, then became a footnote, then became the kind of case that only true crime researchers and the surviving families of the victims remembered with any real intimacy. And Bobby Joe Maxwell sat in prison, growing older, growing sicker, filing appeals that went nowhere. The crack in the foundation appeared, as it so often does in these cases, not because the system corrected itself, but because the system's corruption became too large to ignore. In the 1980s, a scandal began to emerge from inside the Los Angeles County jail system. A scandal involving jailhouse informants who had been systematically fabricating confessions in exchange for reduced sentences, early releases, and other prosecutorial favors. The practice was not occasional or isolated. It was pervasive. It was, by any honest accounting, industrialized. Sidney Storch's name appeared at the center of it. The man who had claimed Maxwell confessed the Skid Row murders to him, in detail, including the critical detail about forgetting to wear gloves, was identified as a habitual liar and a serial fabricator by investigators examining the broader scandal. Storch, it emerged, had made a practice of targeting high-profile cases, reading everything published about them, and then presenting himself to prosecutors as a man who had heard the defendant confess. He would have been in jail anyway, but testimony against a high-profile suspect guaranteed him better treatment, earlier release, and the particular satisfaction of a man who had found a way to make his dishonesty profitable. He had done it in Maxwell's case. He had done it in other cases. And by the time investigators were ready to address the Storch problem directly, to charge him with the perjury he had committed, he was already dying in prison. He never faced a jury for what he had done. He never looked Bobby Joe Maxwell in the eye and answered for the decades stolen from him. He died as he had lived, evading the full consequences of his actions right up to the end. But his death did not end the legal reckoning he had set in motion. Maxwell's attorneys, armed with the emerging evidence of Storch's systematic dishonesty, pressed his case forward with renewed urgency. They raised the issue of prosecutorial misconduct. Specifically, the fact that jurors had never been told that Storch had negotiated an early release from prison in exchange for his testimony against Maxwell. This was a Brady violation, a failure to disclose material evidence to the defense, and it was precisely the kind of constitutional failure that appellate courts exist to address. In 2010, the Ninth United States Circuit Court of Appeals, one of the most powerful appellate courts in the country, issued a 42-page ruling ordering that Bobby Joe Maxwell should receive a new trial or be released. The court's language was remarkable in its directness. It called Sidney Storch a habitual liar. It detailed his long history of fabrication, forgery, and fraud. It described the jailhouse informant scandal he had helped create. And it found that the failure to disclose Storch's deal with prosecutors had denied Maxwell a fair trial. 31 years after his arrest, 26 years after his conviction, Bobby Joe Maxwell finally had a federal court's acknowledgement that something had gone catastrophically wrong. He was not immediately freed. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, facing the collapse of its star witness, chose to pursue a new trial rather than release Maxwell. The office obtained fresh indictments on 3 of the 5 murder counts that had ended in mistrial in 1984. Maxwell was denied bail and remained in custody. He was now in his 60s, in poor health, having spent more than 3 decades inside a system that was now, at least partially, acknowledging that it had failed him. The evidence that had formed the foundation of his original conviction had largely been destroyed over the decades. Routine evidence disposal protocols that no one had thought to suspend for a case still in active legal dispute. The forensic landscape had shifted dramatically since 1978 and 1984. DNA technology, which had not existed at the time of the original investigation, was now available, and cold case detectives obtained a DNA swab from Maxwell after the 2010 ruling. But with most physical evidence gone, the power of modern technology to resolve the question could not be fully applied. The question, the enormous, aching, essential question, remained: was Bobby Joe Maxwell the Skid Row stabber, or was he an innocent man who had been crushed by a system that needed an answer badly enough to manufacture one? In 2017, as preparations for his new trial were finally underway, Bobby Joe Maxwell suffered a massive heart attack. He collapsed. He was taken to a hospital, where he fell into a coma so deep, so total, that he never surfaced from it. His body continued to function. His mind had gone somewhere unreachable. He lay in that state for months while his case moved through the courts without him, argued by lawyers on his behalf, adjudicated in a courtroom he would never enter. In August 2018, 40 years after Jesse Martinez's body was found in an alley at 5th and Wall Streets, 40 years after the blade first moved through the darkness of Skid Row, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office dropped all remaining charges against Bobby Joe Maxwell. All of them. The conviction was formally vacated. He was found not guilty. His imprisonment and conviction were declared a miscarriage of justice. He never knew. In April of 2019, Bobby Joe Maxwell died in the hospital, still in the coma from which he had never recovered. He was 69 years old. He went to his death without the knowledge that his name had been cleared, that the system that had taken 35 years from him had finally, technically, belatedly, conceded its error. He never heard those words spoken in his presence. He never had the moment, the human moment, the irreplaceable moment, of standing in open air as a legally innocent man and breathing the specific breath of someone whose name has been returned to them. That moment was taken from him too. And the Skid Row stabber, Luther, the man with the slow walk and the soft voice and the knife that never hesitated, remains, to this day, unidentified. His face is not in any database. His name is not in any charging document. 47 years after Jesse Martinez was found in that alley, the murders are officially unsolved. The case is open, technically, but cold in the way that cases get cold when every witness has aged out of reliability, when evidence has been destroyed, when the passage of time has turned a solvable crime into something that can only be studied and mourned. 11 men: Jesse Martinez, Jose Cortez, Bruce Emmett Drake, J.P. Henderson, David Martin Jones, Frank Floyd Reed, Augustine E. Luna, Milford Fletcher, Frank Garcia, and 2 others whose names deserve to be spoken aloud in every telling of this story. All of them were murdered. All of them were robbed of whatever life remained to them, however small, however fragile. All of them deserved better than the city they died in gave them, in life and in death, and in the decades of institutional neglect that followed. Somewhere, perhaps, the Skid Row stabber lived out the rest of his years. Perhaps he is already dead, carried off by time, by illness, by the anonymous end that awaits everyone eventually. Perhaps he watched the Bobby Joe Maxwell case unfold on some television in some room in some city and felt nothing. Perhaps he felt relief. Perhaps, in the cold arithmetic of whatever passed for a conscience inside him, he believed that he had genuinely done those men a mercy. That the inscription on the bathroom wall at the bus terminal was not a boast but a mission statement, sincerely held. My name is Luther. I kill winos. I put them out of their misery. The handwriting is long gone from that wall now. The building has been demolished, replaced, absorbed into the endless cycle of urban renewal that Skid Row has perpetually resisted. But the words exist in court documents, in police reports, in newspaper archives, in the memory of every person who has spent time with this case and felt that particular chill that comes from reading the self-justification of a mass murderer rendered in ordinary handwriting on an ordinary wall. Luther knew what he was doing. Luther had reasons. Luther walked among the most forgotten people in Los Angeles with a knife and a smile and a soft voice, and then he disappeared so completely that 47 years of investigation have not been able to put a legal name to his face. He is the ghost of Skid Row, and he may never be found. The men he killed were not winos. They were not people whose misery needed ending by a stranger's blade. They were human beings, imperfect, struggling, suffering, but alive, and deserving of the remainder of whatever life was theirs. Jesse Martinez was a cook. J.P. Henderson was 65 years old and had seen the world. David Martin Jones had friends who wept for him, who spoke to the police because they wanted his killer caught. Luis Alvarez was 26. Their names are the ones that deserve to be remembered. Not Luther, not the ghost, not the blade, the men it touched. Thank you for listening and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.